All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. We're going to get started. So I just, am briefly going to welcome Professor Andrea Freeman here. Thank you all for being here, and she can do a much better job of introducing herself and her topic. So she's going to speak, and then we're going to do Q&A. We only have one mic and only one of me, so if you can just be patient, I'm going to kind of work our way around the room once we have time for questions. Thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you, Alex. I'm really grateful to Alex and all the organizers of this conference. Bring me all the way to snow from Hawaii. So it is a real treat for me to just look out the window and see this pretty white stuff, which I'm sure you're not all as happy about as I am. So thank you, Alex, and thank you, everyone, for coming here. I really want to make this an interactive discussion. I'm going to first share some of my ideas about this theory that I've been developing of food oppression, and then I want to open up the room to brainstorm on how it can be extended to areas that you think about and work in. So here's a quick definition. Institutional, systemic, food-related law, action, or policy that physically debilitates a subordinated group. And I've divided it into 5 elements. So a facially neutral law with a disproportionate harmful impact. Law students will be familiar with this kind of analysis. Health disparities in food-related conditions between the subordinated or marginalized groups and the dominant one. A corporate influence over the government that contributes to this, and the existence of cultural values and racial stereotypes that make this oppression seem natural and make any kind of structural reform seem irrelevant or futile. So far, I've been thinking and writing about food oppression in the context first of fast food and food deserts, the methods that the USDA uses to sell the milk surplus, which I'll go into, farm subsidies, you're welcome, no problem, racial disparities in breastfeeding, nutrition labeling, and behavioral economics. So I'm going to spend some time walking through some of these examples. I don't have time to do them all. And then, as I said, open it up. But feel free to stop me anytime if you want to comment or ask a question. So the heart of this theory is the existence of very dramatic racial health disparities. So here's heart disease. You see much higher for black men and women. Mortality from heart disease. Cancer. Death from cancer. Diabetes. High blood pressure. It's every food-related illness or death, there are racial disparities. Okay. I also have a focus, because of where I live now, on Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, something I've been starting to look at, who suffer from poor health status, more hypertension, more diabetes. Native Hawaiians experience higher cancer and mortality. And Native Hawaiian diets have changed quite a bit after the overthrow of the monarchy and colonization. Okay, so there's a deep connection between colonization and change in diet. Many of you may know that Spam is a very popular food in Hawaii. And this, of course, is a result of agricultural systems that are traditional being broken down and people forced to export all of their food from what they call the mainland. So many things can explain the health disparities, including racism in medical treatment, lack of recreational opportunities in poor neighborhoods, inadequate health insurance. But I argue that differences in diet play a major part in health disparities, and that food policy largely determines people's diets. the corporations are able to influence food policy so greatly that the government ends up prioritizing health, prioritizing corporations over health. And this is contrary to what most people believe our government, at least, is supposed to be doing, if not what it does. And the decisions that lead to the racial health disparities go unchallenged because of common perceptions, like the myth of personal responsibility that we just had a fantastic panel on next door, and racial stereotypes, like a welfare queen, perception of some cultural groups or racial groups as lazy, stupid, or greedy, and therefore more likely to make poor choices and to get sick. So corporations can exploit these racial stereotypes because they deflect attention away from structural solutions and onto the individual. So here we have George Bush happily giving a talk at the Wendy's headquarters in Ohio, okay, showing his solidarity with fast food. Here he is eating a burger. Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan at Wendy's. So why are these politicians so enamored of the fast food companies? Is it because they're just so delicious and tasty? I don't think so. It's because these industries give a lot of money to politicians. Okay? Their executives also enjoy revolving positions with the administration. And not only do the corporations seek to curry the favor of politicians, they work to embed themselves in communities where they know they can make a lot of money. And in many low-income urban communities, fast food is the only game in town. So they're basically only competing against each other for consumer dollars. So again, if you were in the last panel, there was a discussion of the McTeacher's Night. We have fast food in classrooms in public schools. This is programming sponsored by McDonald's that gets put on in a classroom. McDonald's sporting events. McDonald's Community Day. See a wrapper there. A theme of being deeply rooted in the community. Community projects to build playgrounds. And again, we saw in the other room a slide about how many playgrounds McDonald's runs, more than any private entity. And race-targeted marketing techniques, like an African American Family Day. Race-targeted ads. It's a little bit of old school advertising here. It's your dinner time in. Up to the present with Kobe Bryant, Salma Hayek. We have race-targeted marketing menus, right? So this is the Fiesta box. They recently got in trouble for insulting tamales, right? They ran an ad campaign saying that burritos were better than tamales and upset a lot of people because tamales are actually something that's eaten on special religious and spiritual occasions. That was a little bit of a faux pas. They do special race-targeted seating. So in Latino neighborhoods, they put in more family-style seating and race-targeted websites. So, me encanta, McDonald's. All right. So they've embedded themselves in these communities through racial targeting and marketing. And they get ringing endorsements from famous politicians. This is what they get in response, in return for the financial support that I showed you. So they get to be in classrooms. They get to be on public school grounds, including state universities. And they get subsidization of all the major ingredients in their foods, including meat, dairy, wheat, oil, and corn sweeteners. So the subsidies distort the market because they create a much higher supply than there is demand. In the case of milk, there's been a 30-year decline in demand following a substantial amount of medical research that reported on the detrimental health effects of consuming milk, especially high-fat milk. So since these studies came out over 30 years ago, the USDA has been advising people to consume less high-fat milk. Okay, they could have given stronger warnings, but because of their ties to the industry, they phrase it in that sort of confusing way. But nonetheless, this has led to a steady decline in demand and a surplus that the USDA then, because of its commitment to dairy farmers through the Farm Bill, has had to buy. So we have caves full of government milk powder. We have government cheese. Now, why is milk so bad? Well, it's linked to all of these health problems. These are quite serious. And then there's also lactose intolerance. So basically, the only people that can tolerate milk are white people from Scandinavia and Northern European countries. Okay? And this has to do with the history of being in these snow regions where they had to turn to their herds and drink their milk. Okay? So they built up this immunity. And the phrase lactose intolerance is actually a racist paradigm on this normal function. The normal functioning is not to be able to tolerate lactose, right? So some have suggested we should call this lactose persistent, right? Instead of pathologizing the inability to drink milk. So lactose intolerance is not a serious illness like the other ones that I mentioned, but it is something that affects people daily, particularly when challenged by the recommendations by the USDA that people should drink milk and a common popular perception that it should be in our diets. So despite having all this knowledge about milk's harm to health, especially for non-whites, the USDA set about trying to get rid of the surplus by creating a marketing branch, which was financed by a checkoff program for dairy farmers. So it's DMI. And what DMI did is secretly team up with fast food companies to build partnerships to make new products to sell more cheese. So they got together with Domino's and created a pizza line of 7 cheese pizzas, American legends. They thought of the product, they marketed the product, they had a splash launch on the Super Bowl, all of this by the USDA-sponsored marketing branch. Okay. They also work with Taco Bell. I hope you're not getting hungry. I know lunch is coming up, and don't mean to torture you, but here's a steak and cheese quesadilla, Cheesy Bites, Pizza Hut, Burger King's cheesy burgers. So all of this brought to you by the USDA. DMI also created this very successful campaign, Got Milk, with the celebrity mustaches. That lasted over 20 years and won many awards. They also use race-targeted advertising. Here you see Serena Williams, Sofia Vergara, and a lot more. So Spike Lee's participation actually sparked a controversy, some labeling him as a race traitor for his participation. And this bus ad in Berkeley also was the target of some criticism. So the USDA's support of the dairy industry also leads it to make a major part of the school lunchroom program, likely leading to Congress's controversial decision to label pizza as a vegetable for the purpose of school lunches. So this was the butt of many jokes. All right. Yeah, even the vegetables didn't believe it. Oven baked, fresh, FDA approved vegetables, and even Pizza Hut now selling vegetables. This also leads, as I said, to mixed messages in the dietary guidelines. So the USDA's dual responsibilities as nutrition advisor to the nation through the federal dietary guidelines and responsible entity for agriculture also creates other conflicts, for example, with fruits and vegetables. So the guidelines say that we should eat several servings a day, but the United States doesn't actually have the agricultural capacity to keep up with that demand. We would need 13 million more acres of planting of fruits and vegetables in order just to meet the guidelines. And the guidelines are not even as far as we would probably need to go. So why not? because the Farm Bill subsidizes foods that are grown by the large agricultural companies. Now, there was a time when this made sense. So in 1933, the first Farm Bill, the greatest problem in the country, nutrition-wise, was hunger and malnutrition. Medical research came out saying that people needed to consume fats and sugars in order to fatten up and become a healthier nation. So then we had these subsidies begin for corn, soy, wheat that could be either eaten or converted into products that would help help people gain weight. But over time, that has evolved. And now the biggest public health concern is over obesity, right? So obesity in part emerged from this food policy, and now food policy is exacerbating the worst national health crisis instead of responding to it. Okay, there are many problems with obesity as well that I won't get into at this point of the talk, but could talk about later from a racial perspective, right? So obesity is measured by the BMI, your height versus weight. It's not a scientific measurement, and many critics see it as socially constructed and part of a greater plan of social control over black and brown bodies, because particularly black and Latina women are diagnosed far more often with obesity than white women. But that's a side note. So even though our health situation changed, farm subsidies didn't change with them. Why not? Well, look at all the resources that agribusiness put into the 2014 Farm Bill. Okay, the numbers are up there. So we ended up with the status quo. And almost, I guess about 80 years later, we're still subsidizing at pretty much the same percentages as in 1933. So looking at the elements of food oppression that I began with, farm subsidies appear to be racially neutral, right? They're not talking about race, they're talking about commodities. But in fact, the choice of what to subsidize does have a racial effect. For one thing, it results in 98% of subsidies going to white farmers. Okay? It also has a class effect. The richest 10% of farmers and corporations get 75% of the subsidies. They get subsidies in hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the lower income farmers get $5,000 a year. This class effect also manifests itself in how subsidies affect food prices. So while the price of foods that are subsidized has gone down, the price of unsubsidized fruits and vegetables has gone up. And as the price of fruits and vegetables go up, their consumption goes down. So this decline has a serious effect on health. Researchers report that consuming only 2 additional servings of fruits and vegetables a day would significantly reduce the risk of all major diseases and mortality. And for the first time, poor diet is almost the leading cause of death in the United States. Okay. Poor diet is linked to subsidies for several reasons, primarily availability and cost. Okay. So these 2 factors lead to a disproportionate harm to poor people and people of color. So I'll start with the example of corn. Because of the surplus and the unpalatability of the corn that is grown by the major corn producers who get the subsidies, corn is now not really grown for people just to eat a stalk of corn. Okay. Instead, it gets sold as gas, mixed into gas as ethanol. It gets sold as animal feed and converted into high fructose corn syrup. Okay. Animal feed has declined because there's been a decline in animal production. So now it's primarily going into food. So I had a great experience last night that really reinforced this point. I wanted to go to JJ Licks, which is your famous ice cream place, and I was asking them an ingredient about whether something was vegan or not, and he pulled out the ingredients and he said, the only thing I can never help people with is if they want something without corn. We do not have any products in this ice cream store that do not contain corn. And I said, thank you, I'm going to talk about that tomorrow. Right? So corn is now ubiquitous, right? And sweetened beverages like soft drinks and sports drinks and energy drinks are cheaper than juice or even water, okay? So when it costs less to buy a can of soda than a bottle of water, if you don't have a lot of money, then that's what you're going to buy, right? And that's the smart decision. These beverages, because of the high profit margin, are sold in every corner store, especially in low-income neighborhoods where other options are not available. The USDA needs to support the industry, so they let it into schools. So even though we've had movements of removing soft drinks out of the cafeteria, in a lot of those schools, you just have to walk down the hallway and there's the vending machine. So they're not actually getting out of schools, they're just getting out of that room. Okay, soybeans. So soybeans, they look so healthful and green, but in fact, they get converted into oils, like trans fats, and they get inserted into food almost as much as corn in the forms of soy lecithin, soy protein isolate, all sorts of soy products. And soy is linked to many serious health problems too, including malnutrition, digestive distress, immune system breakdown, thyroid dysfunction, cognitive decline, reproductive disorders, infertility, cancer, and heart disease. Nonetheless, school lunchrooms serve foods very high in these types of oils, such as tater tots and corn dogs. Even where a public school has a gardening program, which has become very popular, and my own kids go to a school that has a massive organic farm on the grounds where the kids learn to produce the food, they cannot eat this food in their cafeteria. The school gives the food away to local fancy restaurants, and the kids do not get it. And that's because of federal regulations that don't allow it into the lunchrooms. The kids who are enrolled in public school lunchroom programs get over half of their daily calories at school. And if they live in a poor neighborhood, they have very few healthy options at home as well. So if they eat out, they generally need to go to a fast food restaurant because that's what's there. There are no grocery stores, right? We've had a flight of all grocery stores from urban neighborhoods. Only corner stores with unhealthy foods, preservatives, and these drinks. So the USDA also uses its other nutrition programs besides school lunchrooms, WIC, which is Assistance for Women and Children in Need, and SNAP, which is food stamps, to create markets for subsidized commodities. So you can buy soda with your food stamps, but you can't buy toilet paper, okay? And WIC distributes food. And connected to my other project on breastfeeding, for example, they distribute infant formula, which is made up of either milk or soy, both subsidized commodities. Okay, so racial disparities. Blacks are disproportionately represented in the federal food programs, okay? They also tend to dominate the neighborhoods where fast food is dominant. These factors lead to the health disparities that I showed in the beginning. And all of these factors are part of a food policy framework that could be changed to reduce or eliminate health disparities and improve health generally. So why doesn't it change? One reason is the industry capture that I described at the beginning. Another is the structure of the USDA as an agency with multiple tasks, right? So they have prioritized their commitment to agriculture over their commitment to health. But another is the popular beliefs about health that were so incredibly demonstrated in the next room before this that I'm not going to spend as much time as I would on it, but for those who were not there, and particular to food policy, there are two frameworks. One is called healthism, and one is called biomedical individualism that dominate discourse about food. So healthism is basically that a person who is fat is a bad person because that fat is an outer manifestation of laziness, stupidity, and lack of willpower, right? Under biomedical individualism, a person is sick, and they deserve to be sick because they brought the disease upon themselves through irresponsible behavior. Okay, so this theory developed in the context of the AIDS epidemic, but it has been expanded to explain a lot of medical approaches. So in both these cases, there's little incentive for the state to intervene, to heal sick people. First, because it's wrong to spend the money of good taxpayers to correct the mistakes of weak, fat, sick freeloaders in society, right? Second, because government intervention would just be futile, because these freeloaders who don't suffer the consequences of their bad choices by having to pay to correct them would just make these choices again and repeat the cycle endlessly. Another element to this is racial stereotyping. So the welfare queen is the dominant racial stereotype of our time, I would say. And welfare queen is a constructed identity that has several components. So we have a black, poor woman, not married, has a child or children, and takes money from the government. Okay, so Ange Marie Hancock is a political scientist who has deconstructed this identity and explains that multiple identities, such as these, contain a lot of coded messages about the welfare queen specifically, but it has been extended to welfare recipients generally. Okay? As people who are moral degenerates, they're deviants, and they're human debits to society. Okay? And she talks about how that framing of welfare recipients has led to what she calls the politics of disgust. Okay? And that discourages any government responsibility for improving benefits, and in the food context, improving health for these undeserving citizens. Traditional stereotypes about blacks, such as that they are lazy or unintelligent, also feed into an understanding of health as a manifestation of culture and not structural conditions. So, how do we get here? My happy slide. Okay. Some of food oppression is linked to aspects of our society that are so deeply rooted that it's almost ridiculous to talk about them as solutions, right? So it's deeply rooted in racism and a lot of the conditions that put people into the situations of being dependent on federal nutrition programs, of living in poor neighborhoods, are the manifestation of historical discrimination beginning in slavery that continues today in every aspect of life, right? Employment, education, criminal justice, child protection services, on and on. That's too hard for us to solve as food policy advocates, right? Capitalism is another deep root of this, right? The way the system works is that we have winners and losers, and some people are going to be sick and die. Nonetheless, I don't want to lose all hope. I think smaller steps and an incremental approach to the problem is possible. Raising awareness, stopping, possibly, farm subsidies, or at least having them reflect demand, or the dietary guidelines. Breaking up the USDA's dual roles. The most important thing is probably separating industry and government, but again, that doesn't seem like it's going to happen anytime soon, right? We look at Supreme Court decisions like Citizens United, and we see that corporations are actually being more entrenched in our society, right? But at least in areas of health, I think we should see a stronger movement to try to get separation. We should not cut food stamps, okay, which the last Farm Bill did, which had the greatest health effect of the bill. And at the very least, we should be giving kids healthy lunches. Okay, so that brings me to the end of what I plan to present. I do have extra slides here if anybody wants to talk about any of the other subjects that I brought up, but I would like to open up the floor and see what your take on food oppression is.
Okay, so I have a microphone that I'm hopefully going to give to you so we can get your voice on the recording. So I'm going to start over here if anybody has questions.
Or comments.
Or comments.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It's really insightful, actually. I guess it's just more a comment than a question, and relates to NAFTA, of course, the way in which the search of the corn industry in the U.S. cannot be unlinked from NAFTA in 1993.
Yeah.
And you say subsidies, we call them dumping because of the effects that it had. And I guess that my comment was just like the operation is not only to your society, but it's also extended to the people in Latin America.
Yeah.
And what is really, I don't know how to say, I don't know what the word would be, but what is really interesting anyways is the fact that all these people that used to farm the corn before 1993 are now serving the food in this Taco Bell and McDonald's. And we had a panel earlier about labor, and all those people also used to be the farmers of the proper corn, this millenary corn that is now being, overtaken by this Monsanto and transgenic.
Right.
So the operation is actually bigger.
It's global.
Yeah, it's global.
Yeah.
It's only,
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm a Canadian, so we also
With
felt
NAFTA.
effects of NAFTA, but not
Okay.
to the extreme that other countries did. Yeah, that's a wonderful point of sight for this analysis.
Hi, my name's Amanda Gregory, and you just mentioned you were Canadian, which was what I was going to touch on. I'm an adjunct professor at UDM, and we have a joint JD program with the University of Windsor for U.S. and Canadian law students. And my question, I just want to know if you could give us a little bit of information about how this spreads into Canada, and if there are similar issues, and to what degree in Canada.
I can't. I don't know. Yeah, I'm Canadian, but I haven't lived there for over 20 years, so I've been studying the United States. But it would be a great project. Yeah, thank you.
Hi. I had a quick question about one of the first things that you mentioned, which was the racially targeted advertising. I'm sure we can all agree that advertising in general is almost always a form of manipulation, but we also know that it's extremely effective. And most advertising is sort of depicts white people as like the main consumer, I guess. But diversity in advertising has been increasing as our awareness of, the importance of representation increases. I was wondering how you determined what is specifically racially targeted versus just an attempt at diversifying the people that we depict as consumers.
Yeah, so I think I would push back on your comment about, advertising is diversifying as a result of an understanding of the greater, it's diversifying because of market. It's market driven, right? People are saying, oh, those are people I can make money from, right? And you can make a lot of money off a large stratum of the population, right? These are the corporations exploiting the fact that people are poor, right, and racially oppressed, and saying we can make money off of that. So I wouldn't make a distinction between, I'm not sure what you're getting at. Like, are you saying, well, Serena Williams is a celebrity for everybody, so I don't think that's race-targeted marketing? To me, if there's a black woman on the ad, then that's a race-targeted ad.
I guess what I was getting at is that when we look at an ad and there are white people in it, we don't think that that's targeted specifically at white people, because white people in general tend to be the representation of our country as a whole,
right,
and even of the world as a whole.
Right.
And so, to look at an ad with a white person and say, oh, they're trying to target white people, we don't really do that because white is kind of our default mode in a lot of cases. But then to look at an ad with, a black person or an Asian person or a Latino person and say, oh, they must be specifically targeting that community.
The answer is in your question.
Okay.
Yeah, you've already given yourself the answer, right? Because you're saying the norm is whiteness. That's true. Whiteness is what we all supposedly are, right? So whenever there's a departure from that norm, then that's race targeted.
Okay.
It's a conscious decision to say, oh, we're not going to represent whiteness here. We're going to represent something else so that maybe those people will buy our product.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm not exactly don't know how to phrase this question exactly, but you had mentioned about how McDonald's or, fast food in particular tends to be concentrated in areas where low income, areas that are dominated by people of color, which is, I 100% on board with that. Mm-hmm. I guess the trouble is, what's the alternative? It's not like there are healthy, convenient, low-priced fast food companies out there.
Right.
Even if you look at the next best, I wouldn't necessarily call Subway the next, but maybe they have slightly higher vegetable proportions in their food. Even that is well beyond the price point of a McDonald's meal for your family. So
right.
How do you is it purely subsidies that need to change to encourage that kind of healthy alternative, or what else can we be doing to encourage healthier eating in families that don't have the time or money to do so?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of great movements in different communities to try to improve access to healthy foods, right? There you have urban agriculture, you have farmers markets, you have drives to get supermarkets to come back into low-income neighborhoods, right, by subsidizing them, or, some of them are saying they're going to charge more in the wealthier areas so they can afford to be in the low-income areas. But I think subsidies are key. I mean, this is so driven by price, right? So if a Big Mac actually costs what a Big Mac costs, then people who don't, need to stretch the dollar would not buy it, right? So I think that we live in a market economy, and that's where we have to look. Right? If the government would stop supporting fast food and making it the cheapest thing, so of course it dominates poor neighborhoods, right? Then people would choose alternatives.
Just a quick
yeah.
I know at the farmers market in my neighborhood, they've started doubling your EBT points.
Yeah.
Where does that come from? Is that I don't know enough to know?
The Farm Bill. It's the Farm Bill. So the 2014 Farm Bill has built into it some incentives for purchasing fruits and vegetables with your food stamps, also for farmers markets that weren't able before to use it. So they have built, I have a paper that's coming out soon, and it's about the 2014 Farm Bill and what happened. And so they've included a lot of those minor incentives. Right, but at the same time, they're saying, oh, sure, if you're on food stamps, we'll match your fruit and vegetable purchases. They're not making fruits and vegetables economical for people to farm, right? So they're still not subsidizing fruits and vegetables, but they're tossing a little bit of money of people on food stamps to say, okay, here's a few extra dollars if you make that choice. Right?
Hi. I really liked one of your points about the farm subsidies or the commodity subsidies for the particular products in McDonald's supply chain and the food that they serve. And I guess I was wondering if you could speak a little more about whether you think food service companies like McDonald's are actually what their role is in securing those subsidies versus other agribusinesses and corporate farming type entities. Because when we have conversations about the Farm Bill, and it's only because the word farm is in it,
yeah.
all we think of it is oh, this is for corporate agriculture, this is for farmers, this is not really about the other people who are benefiting from it. So I guess you just who's really, or in your research, I'm not sure what comes across, who's really in control of that process?
It's a combination. And that's why I put the slide up in the beginning. I know I had 75 slides, so, but of the industry contributions. So the fast food industry, very similarly to the agribusiness, they do campaign contributions. They spend a ton of money on lobbying, right? Half of the people who work in McDonald's executives also worked in the administration, right? So you have that same revolving door. So they have a lot of power. And they share an agenda with agribusiness, right? So they work together to lobby for subsidies that support them.
Do you see it at, I guess with the campaign contributions and the revolving door, do you see that a greater presence than the agribusinesses, or are they 50-50 equal partners?
It's a
I
good
don't know
question.
what
Yeah, I
the
don't know.
numbers now, I guess.
Yeah, I would need to put the two charts together and add it up, which we could probably do here, but maybe we should do it after. But yeah, that's a good point.
Okay. I saw that you spoke about the main or two of the big subsidized items being corn and soybeans, which is also interesting because those are the two of the top genetically modified foods in this country as well. And you touched upon how that got started, but you went by it fast. So I was hoping that you could clarify when that happened and why it happened and why they chose to subsidize those food items specifically.
Yeah. So the first agricultural subsidies started in 1933 with the Agricultural Act, and it was a response to the Depression. So it was a combination, right, that had dual goals. On the one hand, they wanted to support farmers. On the other hand, they wanted to heal the population because there was all this hunger and malnutrition. So I don't know the history of the lobbying that took place at that time, but undoubtedly, you know, those were the farmers who had the most power, right? But they've both evolved over that time to become more and more powerful because it's very cyclical, right? Once you're subsidized and people want to get the subsidies, and then they grow bigger and bigger, right? And you get large-scale farming, which then leads to the corn not being, you know, good for human consumption. And it's just this cycle that has been impossible to get out of, right? Logically, there would have been a shift. As I said, when public health concerns changed, the subsidies should have reflected that. But by then, they were so entrenched. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. My question connects both with the previous question and the one before that. So we know that there's a lot of lobbying, a lot of corporate influence, and it's not going to go away at the national level. At the same time, we know that there are a lot of local food policy efforts that are taking place, things that you talked about. How do we put more healthier foods in corner stores, for instance, or how do we double the dollars at farmers market? So how do we actually connect the two dots, right? How do we actually get national food policy to reform in the public interest versus the corporate interest? How do we shape that?
That's what I was hoping you were going to tell me. I mean, I really like the work that they were doing over there with the corporate abuse and trying to build a social movement. Because I think, you know, we've seen historically social movements cannot correct all of our society's ills, but I think they can push law and policy in the right direction. And some of it is, you know, a disinformation campaign, because we have so many wrong messages about what's healthy, right? There has to be some disaggregation in nutrition information from, you know, the corporations and the federal agencies, right? Just to get to the dietary guidelines and to alter them, because they shape all of the nutrition programs, right? But there's just, right now, there's no entry point at which to reframe the whole nutritional model, right?
Yeah, and I should add that, just for context, I'm with the Union of Concerned
Yeah.
Scientists, and we do a lot of all of those steps. You know, we're trying to push back on misinformation and trying to expose the influence of corporations on the food system. But I think overall there is an uphill battle because we are fighting against very large dollars.
Yeah, I mean, what's important to me and what I'm doing, because I'm combining critical race theory and food policy analysis, and that connection is not really made by either side right now, right? So critical race theory is a robust field, right, in law and others, but they have not taken up the issue of food justice at all. And on the food justice side, there are a lot of people, and you know, many people in this room and at this conference, who are interested in food justice, but not from a critical race perspective, right? So not kind of deconstructing how all these policies have this disproportionate harm and then trying to attach it, right? So even to get, there's a step in between a social movement and where we are now, which is even getting, you know, people who are in this room who have the level of privilege that we have to disseminate these ideas and to think about them and take them back to organizations, to law schools, to universities, to make people understand how important it is, right? So that once you get 100 articles talking about it, or, you know, then someone's going to pay attention, or, you know, maybe the judge in the Pellman, right? So we saw examples in the other talk, right? But so judges will talk about it, policymakers will talk about it, and then you hope for some kind of trickle down as well. It's fine. I like to give meditation moments in my classroom too, so let's all just breathe and yeah.
So on the subject of federal policy, another set of very controversial policies is around health insurance and Obamacare, and it seems like when the government has, you know, taken on a greater burden of covering health insurance costs, there would be an incentive to increase preventative medicine to reduce the overall expenses that the country has to pay. And do you think that there's an opportunity for this moment where health insurance and rising healthcare costs are such a hot topic? Do you think there's an opportunity to capitalize on that and inform food policy as part of a preventative care movement? Or do you think the two are such disparate policy areas at this point that they will remain such?
I think that you're absolutely right, that they're connected and this should be a moment, right? But there needs to be a reframing of understanding health to be able to do that, right? Because it's so fundamental to people's perceptions of health that it's reactive, right? You do something, you get sick. So that's the biomedical individualism model that I was talking about, and the healthism one, right? So in order to get to that framing that you're talking about, there has to be a shift in perceptions of health, and I'm not sure where that's going to come from.
I'd just like to point out that there's an organization, New Haven, Connecticut, called New Haven Farms, that's partnered with Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare to provide preventative care with CSAs to low-income families in the New Haven area. Yeah. And there's various forms of that around the country. I think Wholesome Wave in Connecticut also has one of those. So it's definitely been looked at in the past few years a little more intensively than it has before.
It's great. Keep up your good work. I met some of you at the Yale Food Systems Symposium and got on your emails, so I see the great work that you're doing. Yeah. Cool. That's good.
Thank you so much, Joanne Burke with the University of New Hampshire. Just a quick call out, because dietary guidelines, that we can see the influence of the lobbying. So they're up now again for review and feedback, and they have a link. And we're really looking for a lot of people. The Section 5 is talking about the importance of looking at the food system. And although Secretary Vilsack seems to think they've gone beyond and we should just be looking at nutrients, if you can go in and voice the importance of thinking in a systems way regarding food system reform and dietary guidelines that reflect not only our capacity to eat now but into the future, and that food is a right for all people. So they're very long, but they only want 250 words. It's easy. So just get into that dietary guidelines comment section after you say we want SNAP not to be cut and all those other things we need to do. Thanks.
Thanks.
Sure. Under the there's a heading under U.S. dietary guidelines, and then you'll see that right now what has come out is the committee report from HHS and USDA, because they come out from both agencies. But there is, if you look close enough, there's a link for comments, and even though it said they were going to end in mid-April, they've actually had to extend it. But I can tell you the lobbyists are out there really trying to frame it as if this happens, you won't be able to eat meat, and that's not what we're calling. But particularly Chapter 5 talks for a food systems framework. So it's really important because the food industry has surely been framing it as tree huggers against the American way of eating.
Right. You should just start talking.
I'm just kind of interested in whether you see the whole system ever flipping on its head. I do see, I mean, there's clearly a rise in demand for healthy foods. The other day I was driving down the highway and the rest stop was like a healthy food stop. It's changed for once. And there's there's a lot of pieces and moving parts in action nowadays.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you ever see that actually like overtaking and actually turning the system on its head and
Yeah.
kind of timeline we're looking at.
So I see that movement, but I also see it located in a sort of white, wealthier site, right? So I think that movement exists, and that corporations are trying to respond to it, right? So for every healthy rest stop that's a new venture, then you'll see McDonald's trying to put out some kind of healthy food, right? And there's been a decline in their sales, and this is happening. People, especially young people, probably around your age, right, are coming out and saying, we want healthy food, we're going to pay for it, we're using our money to do it, right? But you have that power, you have that consumer power, right, where the people that I'm thinking about and concerned about that's going to be the last, if ever, right? And that divide is probably going to get worse. Right, because the market for healthier, I mean, we all know that healthy food costs more, right? And the more demand, I don't know if it's really going to get cheaper or not. So I see people are getting more and more marginalized into, okay, yeah, I mean, everybody eats fast food, right? And white people eat it the most, but they eat it as a much lower percentage of their diets because they have more choice, speaking generally, right? And so these choices expand, but they're not expanding for all populations. So
We have a question.
probably the answer is no. Yeah.
So big part, I think, of the conversation on processed foods is the corporate consolidation of in the food industry. You look at those diagrams of all of the subsidiary companies that say Kraft owns. And, there's recent news of the merger between Heinz and Kraft, I think. And so this is kind of enabling their control on these food giants. And so I was just wondering what your take was, if you could comment on corporate consolidation and transparency.
Yeah. Transparency is a big buzzword and something. I mean, transparency is so interesting. It goes across all of these conversations, right? So what did the 2014 Farm Bill do that was the most controversial? It took away transparency of who gets subsidies, right? So before that, they had the direct payment method where they paid out to farmers, and that was public information, right? It caused all these scandals. Bruce Springsteen gets farm subsidies. Jimmy Carter gets farm subsidies, right? So in this bill, what they did is they took away direct payments. They replaced it with crop insurance programs, which are still subsidies. It's just that some of the money goes to insurance companies. So now they make money off of it. But as of 2000, all insurance program recipients are secret. So now every single recipient of a subsidy is secret. So we're moving away from transparency, right? The only transparency that is important in this food policy discussion, right, is consumers have a right to know what's in their food. But again, that does not help people who don't have any choice about what they eat, because they're in a school lunchroom program. They're in a neighborhood that doesn't have options, right? They get their food from the food bank. So transparency, to me, is just a diversion away from the real structural issues, right? I think transparency would help some people understand the system better, but it's not an area where I think we can make a lot of progress.
So I think we have time for one more question. So I'm going to...
School lunchroom person, talk to me after. Okay.
At various times and places, we've experimented with the deconcentration of poverty. So I'm just curious if you looked at that at all in terms of how people fare when they're moved out of food deserts and job deserts into areas where healthy food choices are available, grocery stores, et cetera. Because there's also been some challenges with social isolation with deconcentration of poverty. So it hasn't always worked, but I'm curious if you looked at the diet issues there.
I haven't. The only sort of relevant thing that I've looked at a little bit is immigration, right? So you see people coming up from Mexico and other Latin American countries who have wonderful diets, and as soon as they've lived in the United States for not even a generation, their diet and health plummet, right? But as far as specific health number, I don't know if anyone's done studies.
Yeah, just an interesting follow-up. I saw a study overall on health that suggested that Latinos that live in a primarily Latino area have significantly better health outcomes than Latinos that are living dispersed.
Right.
And so it raises kind of interesting sort of culture of food questions.
Right.
You know, of similar socioeconomic status. So.
Yeah, and it turns nicely around to what I was talking about at the very beginning, which is colonization, right? You look at Hawaii, you look at Puerto Rico, and where the United States has moved in and imported its food policy and culture, you've seen a serious decline in health.
So I just want to thank Professor Freeman for her wonderful talk.